Okay, well, thank you. So I think over the last 30 years, the sort of big stories that have been coming out of the bird conservation world have been about farmland birds and the problems of that have been happening on the UK and European farmland. But the new farmland birds are migrants, and I think migrants have really sort of crept up on us as being an issue over the past few years, really because back in the 1970s, when there were large droughts in the Sahel, we were really sort of thinking about species like sedge warblers, sand martins, whitethroats, chiffchaffs. Things like whitethroat declined by, 70% over the course of one winter. UK lost 70% of its whitethroats. But over the past few years, droughts have been getting fewer and far between in the Sahel, and actually these species are recovering. So we thought the migrants were doing okay, and we rather took our eyes off the ball. But there is another group of species, these ones, for example, down at the bottom here, that winter in the wetter parts of West Africa. And these are the species that are now really becoming a bit of an issue. Things like nightingales have declined. This is data for the last 15 or so years from the BTO breeding bird survey, showing really quite a precipitous decline in nightingales. And we might have lost, about half in about 15 or 20 years. And it seems to be fairly common that the species that are wintering further south are doing poorly. So things like wood warblers, a 90% decline in 30-odd years. Spotted flycatchers, something similar. Garden warblers, we're just beginning to see a decline in those as well. And one of the problems with these species is we really know very little about what's happening outside of the UK. So there's a lot of research effort going in from people like ourselves at BTO, RSPB, academic institutions into what's happening during the breeding season for these species. And we know a huge amount about what they do, what's important for them here in Europe. But once they leave the UK, really we have very little idea as to where they go, where the important stopover sites are, where they winter, and really what the issues are in these wintering areas. So at BTO, we've been trying to look at this in more detail. So we've had, for the last 4 winters, a project in Ghana, that's here, and Burkina Faso, which is the country to the north, really trying to work out what these species have been doing in winter. So we chose those 2 countries because they're easy to work in. They provide a nice transect from very wet rainforest on the coast, northwards up to the drier Sahel and the Sahara Desert. So we really get a good idea of what species are where, what habitats they're in, and the kind of things that, some kind of issues that are facing these habitats. But obviously what we don't know is where these species are from. And the thing that really sort of got us thinking was actually, it's not just these species. There are a whole load more species that spend the winter around here in Central Africa, around the Congo. Again, we know very little about what they're doing, and to be honest, it's going to be very difficult to actually get in there and study them because places like Central African Republic, Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo are not the easiest places to work in. And Congo you can work in, but places like Central African Republic are really a no-no area at the moment. So really, this got us really sort of thinking about how we're going to actually tackle what's going on with these species. And tracking seemed to be the way forward. So we chose cuckoo as our model species for a number of reasons. One, it's declining very rapidly, 50% decline in 15 years. It's the largest small nocturnal migrant, and just as I was mentioning to the previous or the next speaker, with birds we've been limited by device size because birds are quite small. The migrants that travel to Africa tend to be, well, for warblers, for example, about sort of 15, 20 grams. And the technology just wasn't keeping up with what we wanted to do. But with cuckoos, we can now get a 5-gram satellite device which will fit onto a cuckoo. For the first time, we can really start to understand where these birds are going, what they're doing at different times of year. We also knew very little about its migration. So this is our standard technology that Bob mentioned earlier, which is through ringing. We have one recovery of a cuckoo in sub-Saharan Africa out of 100 years of ringing, or more than 100 years of ringing. That was caught in June, well, it wasn't caught, it was taken out of a nest in June 1928 in Eton and ringed. It was in a pied wagtail's nest. And then it was found in Cameroon in January 1930 in the village of Lembe, and it was killed and consumed by the hunter that caught it. So that was our some knowledge of what cuckoos do in Africa for the past 100 years or so, until these new technologies came along. This is the device that we're using now. It's a 5-gram, it's essentially a very high quality radio tag, and there are a whole series of satellites flying around up in the sky, and they pick up these signals from this radio, and then using the Doppler effect. So, for example, if you're standing on a platform on a train station and a train's coming towards you, the frequency of the sound changes as it comes towards you and then goes away again. And that's essentially what this technology does, is the satellites will pick up a number of messages from this radio, and then from the change in frequencies as the satellite passes overhead, it can then work out where on the globe you are. So it's not GPS, it's not conventional GPS, which gives you an accuracy of 5 or 6 meters. We get an accuracy of maybe 250, 500 meters out of this. But to be honest, that's good enough for us when you're considering these continental scale movements. The technology is still not entirely as we'd like it. Being so small, it has a tiny battery in it, and we have to use a small solar panel to recharge it. So what we do is we transmit for 10 hours, and then the tag goes off for 48 hours while it recharges, and then it starts again. And because it's not a sort of 12 or 24 hour, or it's not a multiple of 24 hours, the on cycle, we actually get information from different times of the day as well. So it doesn't always come on at 10 o'clock in the morning and go off in the same time in the evening. We get a sort of cycle of what the bird is doing. So we can look at where it's roosting, where it's feeding, and so on. And the great thing about satellite data is you get unbiased information. A lot of the small tracking devices, things like geolocators, which are now down to about 0.2, 0.3 of a gram. The problem is you need to catch the bird again the following year to download the data off it. Because this pushes it up to a satellite remotely, we don't need to do that, and we can just put it on and then sit back, and then the information comes back to us. So for any of those familiar with the BTO cuckoo tracking website, you'll see that we get close to real-time tracking across the annual cycle, and on our website it's updated every morning with the new positions of the birds that we received over the past 24 hours. So how do you go about satellite tagging cuckoos? Well, this was quite a challenge because we didn't know how to catch cuckoos initially. So we developed methods that a colleague of ours, a doctor in Great Yarmouth, helped us with, and this is his stuffed cuckoo who he very kindly lent to us. And what we do is you put a stuffed cuckoo on a stick, you put a male call underneath it, so you've got a tape recorder, you play the male call, and then you put a string of mist nets, which you may or may not be able to see around the cuckoo. And if you're in the right place, the male cuckoos get very excited, and the females sometimes, and come in and try and mate with our stuffed bird, and hopefully get caught. So this was our red letter day. It works better in some places than others, but on that morning, or at that particular occasion, we caught 3 birds. This was in a very isolated valley in Wales, and I think these 3 males were pretty desperate to find a female. So as soon as we started playing the tape, within about 10 minutes, we had 3 birds caught, which was great. So this is Chris Hewson on the left, who's running the Cuckoo Project, Tony Cross, who's a Welsh ringer, who was very helpful to us in helping to find sites and catch birds. So once we caught it, we ring it in the conventional way, and then we fit the radio tag So the radio tag fits on like a backpack, so there's a loop which goes over the head. The device sits here on the sort of top of the back, and then the cords are tied around from underneath the wings and back onto the back of the device. So it's like wearing a rucksack. Everything, all the knots are super glued to make sure they don't come undone. We don't want to lose satellite transmitters or obviously harm the birds. So it does take quite a long time to fit these devices and make sure that the fit is absolutely perfect. These devices cost about £2,300, £400 a go, so we need to be extremely careful how we fit them to make sure we're not affecting the bird, and the information we get is as unbiased as we can get. So there we go. There's a cuckoo with its backpack. It's got its antenna that comes out, and more often than not, it'll preen it into the tail, so it doesn't actually look quite so obvious. So these are some data from the recent breeding and wintering bird atlas that BTO produced a few months ago, showing changes in cuckoo numbers over time. And one of the really interesting things that's come out of the atlas is this fairly common pattern of declines and migrants in the southeast, these are the red dots, and increases in the north and west and upland areas, so central Wales, Dartmoor, Exmoor, and so on. And this seems to be a pretty common pattern. And one of the things we wanted to do was to try and catch some birds in different places, to try and work out if birds from different populations were doing different things. So we caught some birds in East Anglia. We've caught 12 birds over the years, mostly in the Broads, but also in Thetford Forest. We wanted to do some birds in an increasing area, so we've caught them in the Trossachs National Park and up in the area around Skye. There we go. That's, it is a tough job sometimes having to go to these lovely places. Tregaron and Dartmoor, so we wanted to get a lowland, well, not lowland, a southern increasing population, so we can compare it with East Anglia, which is declining. And that's our site for catching, where we caught the 3 birds. You can see 2 of them in the net there, waiting to be taken out. So we've got a number of different sites where we've caught birds, and we can actually start to compare what birds are doing between different sites, different altitudes, and different latitudes as well. So those are our 3 main groups. So what have we learned so far? Well, we didn't really have any basic information about what cuckoos do. So this is just sort of a very quick representation of what birds do in autumn. So we have latitude up here, so 50 degrees north is roughly the UK. And you can see that in the days after June, birds start to drop down in latitude. So we have the first surprise. This talk is called Tales of the Unexpected. It seems that every time you stick a device on birds, you learn something new and exciting. They started to leave at the beginning of June, so I think the first movement was on the 1st of June. And if you think they only arrived in mid-April, they're only spending 6 weeks in the UK. So they're not really British birds at all. They're more African and European birds, or mainland continental European birds. So they spend a bit of time around 40 degrees north, and if your geography is like mine, I didn't really know exactly where that was, but it's the Mediterranean. They take off from the Mediterranean around northern Italy, do the long jump over the Sahara into the dry zone, the Sahel, just below the Saharas, and they stay there up until October time, and then they start dropping down into the wetter areas, into the Congo. So there we go, those are the departure dates. And this was for the first year that we did it, and we wondered, have we actually impacted on the birds? Are we, because we caught them, did it cause them to leave early? But actually, if we look at the timings of these individuals in subsequent years, they're really very similar. So Chris left on the 16th of June in the first year, the 12th of June the next year. Lister left on the 22nd of July the first year, 9th of July in the second year. So we don't think that our catching actually had an impact on when they left. It seems as though some birds leave early, some birds leave late, and the timing seems to be consistent within individuals. The other big surprise was we knew they wintered somewhere down here, so that wasn't necessarily a surprise. What was a surprise was how they got there. So we have the route that we thought they took through northern Italy. They stopped there and then crossed the desert and stop off around Lake Chad, that kind of area around here, before dropping down to the Congo. But these two birds in the first year really surprised us by heading into Spain, and that was a really new thing. We had no idea that birds did this, and actually they travel 8,000 kilometers to get down to the Congo wintering sites, whereas birds that travel more directly take about 3,000 kilometers fewer to get, or travel 3,000 kilometers fewer to get to the same place. So we've got two different strategies here, and we've been doing some genetics, or we haven't, but the University of Bergen in Norway have been doing it. And it seems that there is a genetic difference between birds that take the two different routes. So there must be something about this western route that, despite traveling 3,000 kilometers further, it's able to maintain it in the population. So once they cross the Sahara, they spend these 2 to 4 months, which you might think is surprising given that it's an arid zone, but actually this fits in very well with the timings of the rains in this area. It only rains for 2 months in this area, in July and August, which is literally, well, July is here. So you think the onset of rains in this dry area is here. It goes on to roughly over here. And so you can see that these birds are actually timing their arrival with the arrival of the rains in autumn. And it's green during those 2 or 3 months. And then as it starts to dry out, they then drop down into the wetter rainforest areas. So in winter, we didn't really know where in Congo they wintered. We knew they were probably around there. They might even be further south in Angola. But we also know that a number of other species winter in that area, all of which are declining very rapidly. So we did wonder whether there was a common theme about where birds wintered and why perhaps they were declining. So things like swifts will winter over the rainforest. Nightjars, we know, winter just to the south of the rainforest block here. And corncrakes, we actually think winter in the rainforest block, in these bayous which are kept open by forest elephants. They're sort of wet areas, and you get lowland gorillas and forest elephants coming down. And some tracking that RSPB have done, Rescreen has done, suggests that they're in these areas, these wet areas in the forest as well. But our birds seem to be going to this place called the Teke Plateau, which is in the rainforest zone, but because of topography, it's a bit drier, and you get habitat like this. Now, if I showed you this picture, or this picture, would you think that's in the middle of Congo? It looks more like Scotland. And what's really interesting is that a lot of the birds are actually seem to be matching their habitats that they occur in the UK with habitats that they occur in Africa. And they seem to be in and around the edge of these forests, feeding on the forest edge. That's the best we can make out from the satellite data. But we did have one bird that surprised us, which was Chris, who's our star cuckoo. He's still going. We ringed him in the first year, and he's still going 3.5 years later. He was actually in the forest in this Western Congolian swamp forest, which is again where you get these forest elephants and really exciting ungulates in there, forest ungulates in there as well. So by midwinter, we were sort of not exactly reeling, but we were really excited by what we'd found. We found a lot of new stuff, and the next big thing was what happened in spring. So the conventional wisdom, if you read Reg Moreau's book, who was the sort of grandfather of the Afro-Palearctic bird migration research, he suggested that birds actually took off from Central Africa and did the trip back to Europe in one long hop. And he was right about an awful lot of things, and we were kind of expecting that to happen. But what we got instead was this surprising westerly movement. We saw birds moving into Cameroon, and we thought, okay, well, that's fine. But then they took these big, long hops into Nigeria eastwards, some even getting as far across as Guinea. And we didn't really know what was going on there. We wondered why they were stopping off in West Africa, because really the conventional wisdom is that being wetter further south, there might be more food resources and they could fatten up better and fatten up for resources. So the core spring stopover area seems to be here, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Togo, possibly, yeah, getting into Guinea as well. And really we wanted to try and investigate that a bit more to figure out why birds were doing that and what was making birds do that, because they spent 2 to 3 weeks here, so it was a pretty substantial stopover. So the thing we looked at next was, okay, what are the commonalities of these species that winter in Central Africa? And other tracking has shown to do these westerly movements. Well, the main thing seems to be that birds were not advancing their arrival dates. So all these species are declining quite rapidly. So you can see here in 15 years, 49% decline in cuckoos. But actually, if you look at their arrival dates, most migrants are getting earlier. So if you look at the arrival date trend, you expect these to be minus for 90% of migrants. But for the Central African migrants, they're actually getting slightly later. These figures aren't really significant from zero. So really, what we can infer from this is they're not increasing or getting earlier when they come back to Britain. And of course, there are a lot of advantages if you get back earlier in Britain. Our springs are getting warmer, food bursts are arriving earlier, certainly in some insect groups. So you might think that if you're an insect eater, it might be more advantageous to get back to the UK a bit earlier. But these species seem to be constrained, and we wondered whether something in West Africa was constraining their movement back to the UK. So if we look at the timings of these stopovers in West Africa, we've got individual birds down the vertically. So each horizontal row is an individual bird, and these grey areas show periods of stopovers. So you can see in 2012, bird number 1 had a stopover in West Africa in the middle of February. Another one, it moved on a bit to another site, and then again in March, and then again in April. So that bird had 4 stopover sites in West Africa. So it left Congo and had 1, 2, 3, 4 stops before going back up to the UK. The next bird down moved out of Congo a lot later, but only had 2 stopovers, and so on and so on and so on. So you can see there's quite a range of strategies. So some birds leave in mid-February, some birds even, for example, this one, the second half of March. So they're leaving their wintering areas at very different times. The end of the stopover is more consistent, which is what you might expect, because they do need to be back into the UK by a certain time. We've got some repeat journeys from birds between different years, and the timing seems to be quite consistent. So the strategy for this bird in red, a short stopover, followed by a longer stopover, and again the following year they did pretty much the same thing, a short stopover, then a long stopover, and then back to Europe. The stopover locations of cuckoos are in just north of the forest belt. So we've got the rainforest belt, which is very wet, and then you're in the Guinea savanna just to the north of that, which is where the birds are. So that was useful to look at. But one of the interesting things, again, came out of this was that some birds winter way to the west of the others. We didn't really figure out what was going on. But if we overlay the months, there's a pattern here as well. So if you're earlier, so if you move in February, you tend to stop over further to the east. That's the blue dots. The March dots are in white, and the April dots are in yellow. So it seems as though if you're earlier, you stop over here. If you're later, you stop over quite a long way to the west. And that was quite a striking pattern that came out. So you're going to have to bear with me. I'm building up to a big crescendo. So we now move on to swifts and see what the story is with swifts. So we are using geolocators to track these, and these are small light-gathering devices with an internal clock. So what you can do is you can work out the timing of dawn, the timing of dusk, and you have a clock that's set to a certain time, say GMT, so you can work out the local times of midday and midnight, and then from that you can work out latitude and longitude. It's a great way of doing it. It's not that accurate. It's between, I don't know, plus or minus 100 or 150 kilometers. But for this kind of continental scale movement, that's not too bad. And the beauty of these is they're now down to 0.2, 0.3 of a gram, whereas the satellite devices, which need a lot more power, are sort of 10 times that weight. So anyway, with swifts, we've been able to show this is a fairly typical track. They leave in late August, so it left on the 23rd, sorry, late July. They left on the 23rd of July, stopped over in Spain. A few days later, 26th to 28th of July. Short stopover in Senegal, early August. And then by the 15th of August, they were in the Congo wintering range. And that yellow bit is the main wintering range. Most of our UK birds go to the coast for Christmas, so they tend to leave mid-December and move down to the Mozambique Channel, and they spend a few weeks there before moving back to the Congo in February. And then they start coming back to the UK in mid-April. So they take this oceanic crossing, or this sea crossing, I should say, 15th, 16th of April. That's pretty typical. And then they stop off in Liberia for 2 weeks until late April, and then head back to the UK. The quickest bird that's gone from Liberia to the UK has done it in 5.5 days. And we catch them in the boxes, so because it's recording light levels, we can tell the exact time that they arrive back in their box in the UK. So really very rapid movements, but again, this westerly movement into West Africa in spring, presumably to fatten up for the Sahara crossing. Again, you've got a similar pattern of movements. This red bird is a bird we tracked over 2 years, very similar timings of movements and duration of stopovers. Another bird in red, again, very similar. And then interestingly, we've got one bird that didn't do a stopover. That's that one in green. They did it, a very short one in the first year, but didn't do one in the second year. They migrated straight back from Congo to the UK. So these are our swift locations. They're mostly over the forest, so just to the south of where the cuckoos are, or the south and to the west of where the cuckoos are. Another species, nightjar, we've been tracking. Again, the data for nightjars are pretty ropey, but they do, again, they move into West Africa mid-April, early May. And then when you plot all the birds on top of each other, the reds are the cuckoos, yellows are nightjars, and blues are swifts. So why do they do this? Well, we initially thought it might be wind related, and if you look at the average wind direction and speed over Africa at that sort of time in April, you can see that if you're in Congo, which is roughly sort of here-ish, if you head due north, there are quite strong winds. So it might well be advantageous to move into the west where the winds over the desert are actually less. And that may well be part of it, but we don't think that is the main story. What we think it's to do with is rainfall. There's this equatorial front called the ITCZ, the Intertropical Convergence Zone, that moves north and south throughout the year, and it brings rain with it. So in our summer, it's at its northernmost extent, and in our winter, it's at its southernmost extent. So that's midwinter. You can see in late March, it's moved north, and the rain front is actually coinciding with a lot of these stopover areas which we've identified. But if we zoom in to what this front is doing in Africa, this is rainfall in Africa. So the blue are the heavier areas, the green are slightly less, and the orange orangey area is where the drought-breaking rains are occurring. So that's where the first rains are occurring. So our birds are now moving out of Congo. In late March, it's spilling over into West Africa. And that's where our cuckoos are. By late April, it's spilling over further into West Africa, and that's where the majority of the swifts are. Again, at this edge of this rain front. And this is one of the only graphs I've got. If you look at longitude down the vertical axis and days since the 1st of March, we've plotted where the birds are at different times, at the different staging areas. So if you are further east, so basically high up the graph, if you're early, at the beginning of March, you tend to be further east, but as you go further on in March, staging areas tend to be further west. And we've got 3 different species here. The blues are cuckoos, nightjars are in greeny yellow, and the swifts are in red. So you can see you get similar kinds of relationships within and between species. So it seems as though what's happening is these birds are tracking these rain fronts as they move across West Africa. And that's not surprising because we know that as rains start to fall and droughts start to break, you get massive eruptions of things like termites and ants that have been essentially hibernating in the ground, and then as the rains come, they erupt, and really it's this massive burst of food. And things like swifts are burst feeders. They will feed on bursts, and I guess the cuckoos and nightjars are doing the same as well. So all this spring stopover stuff is all really new and quite exciting, and we're in the process of writing it up. But it seems as though that rainfall is constraining the timing of migration of these Central African wintering species, which is why birds are not arriving back into the UK any earlier, because the timing of these rains hasn't changed over time. It's driven by variation it's driven by the rotation of the Earth, but the intensity is also driven by sunspots, or the intensity of the sun. So there's not a global warming issue here, or climate warming issue here, because it's driven by larger geophysical processes. But it could mean that these birds, when they arrive back in the UK, are slightly out of sync with what's going on with the insects here in the UK. I think I've just summarised all that. But one of the things we really want to do now is to start looking at these stopover sites and looking at habitat in these areas as well, and working with social scientists to try and understand how these habitats in Africa have changed. So that's been really, really interesting. It's been a really useful bit of ecology that we've done, but we've also started to work out where birds are dying, and that's really important when you're trying to understand why populations are changing. Spring mortality tends to occur just after the desert crossing. We've got a few more of mortality now. These hectares mark where birds have died. A lot of the mortality has occurred, or the mortality has tended to occur during poor weather events. So the one in Spain, for example, we had a member in Spain who said, "Oh, a cuckoo's just arrived in Spain, but I doubt it's going to survive. I'll go and look for it tomorrow." And she went out, and it was hailing, and there was frost everywhere, and that bird really just mistimed its arrival into the UK. Oops, sorry, I've been pressing the button too many times. So it's interesting, for the 2012 and 2013, the birds that died were these ones in purple. They tended to be the early one and the late one, so it seems as though timing of migration is really quite important. But what does make a good stopover and a successful or an unsuccessful desert crossing? Well, the main thing that's struck us is this southwest route seems to be a lot more dangerous. We've lost a lot more birds going down this way than compared with the route that's going down through Italy. So we lost 3 birds in 2012, 2 birds in going down the other route. I've got a summary figure somewhere. Yeah, so mortality, 6 out of the 13 birds that went down this way have died. 2 out of 22 that have gone down this way have died on autumn migration. So it seems as though this is a lot more risky than this route. And quite why this route persists in the population, I don't know. There must be some advantage to it. What else have we got? We've got some interesting stuff about ecology. This will appeal to all the migration nerds amongst you. Cuckoos were thought to be night migrants. They're not necessarily. We tracked a bird across the Sahara from 9 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so it was traveling throughout the day, 400 kilometers in 7 hours. That appeals to me. You get some interesting information about site fidelity. So this is a repeat movement. This is Chris, our star cuckoo. In 2 years, he took virtually the same route to get to the same stopover. 1 year, he deviated, and we think that's because there were very strong winds at that time, which pushed him off course, but he managed to reorientate and get back to the same area. Timings are very similar. And the other interesting thing that we're getting is a lot of repeat journeys. So what happens if, or reverse journeys, what happens if you get to an area and it's no good? So we had a bird that left a staging area near Troon, went to Gretna, spent a bit of time there, didn't like it, went to Harwood Forest, obviously didn't like it there, and then returned back to the same site. And we're seeing this in a lot of different birds. So we had a bird this spring that got into Sherborne in Dorset during the really cold spring. And I like that because I went to school in Sherborne, and it was actually on my local birding patch. And he was there for a day, didn't like it, and then flew back into central France, spent 3 weeks in central France, and then came back into the UK after that. So birds do have the ability to sort things out if things go wrong. And this was probably the most extreme. This is featured in The Independent. A bird that staged in the Po Valley in northern Italy, where a lot of birds do. We tracked it across the sea, almost to 100 kilometers from the North African coast. It then did a little kink and then flew all the way back, stopped just north of Rome, and went back to the Po Valley. That's a several thousand kilometer journey. But it seems that these birds are following rules of thumb. Basically, if you get to an area and it's no good, go back to the area where you were last at, where you know that you can survive. So really, just to wrap up, what have we learnt from the tracking? It's given us an incredible insight into the birds' life cycles. It gives us really good information about stopover sites and wintering sites, which mean that when we're directing our field efforts, we can actually go to areas that are relevant to the species. It gives us a lot more information about the environmental conditions that bird faces. So, for example, this spring stopover, we had no idea that these stopovers are really controlled by these drought-breaking rains. And this is probably constraining their arrival time back into the UK. And we think it's applicable to quite a wide range of species. Then from this, tracking is the really exciting bit of a lot of the work that we do. But it gives us really good insights into the sort of more focused bits of fieldwork that we can do to try and answer some of these issues and work out what's affecting these declining populations. And this one was also, this project was also really designed to be a public education exercise, really. Migration is going to become a big issue in the conservation world, and really it's projects like this that highlight the plight of our migrants to the public. So it was a science and a public engagement exercise as well, and that's worked extremely well. Ken Bruce featured our cuckoos in the spring on Radio 2. It crashed the BTO website for half an hour, which is saying something because we're attached to the UEA academic network, which is pretty robust. But yeah, we've gained a huge amount of attention from this. So I'll just leave you with where are they now? So these are movements of all of our birds from the UK, but also from a sister project in Germany and Belarus. They're all still in Central Africa. Some of the Belarusian birds actually wintered down in Southern Africa, but they're all heading back up north and west. And we've got 18 birds that are tracking on the BTO website. So if you fancy finding out what's going on, please go and have a look. It'll be updated every day. And this is really to say thank you to everybody. It's not a lone effort by us. There's an awful lot of people who've helped us, who've funded our work, and given us a lot of support along the way. Thank you.